What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's Daniel here from the GeekSpeakNation channel, and I'm here to bring you my review of Wonder Woman 1984. So, Wonder Woman 1984, I've got to say, it feels really good to have a new movie to watch. Wow, 2020, what a year, man. What a year. And regardless of where you end up watching it, like me, it was on HBO Max, or whether you saw it in theaters, here we are, and we have a direct sequel to, I believe, 2017's, I think is the year it came out, Wonder Woman, directed by Patty Jenkins, and starring Gal Gadot, Chris Pine, and a lot of them end up returning over for this sequel and reprising their roles. One of the interesting things to keep in mind with this film is, of course, not only the way that it was released, and that this is the game-changing death of cinema as we know it, but also, for those who haven't seen the film, this film doesn't quite necessarily fit into the overall timeline of the Snyder-esque DCEU or the kind of rebooted DCEU that's going on. This kind of feels more so like a side story, and try not to think about it and how this fits into the overall continuity, just because there's certain things that end up happening that's like, huh, so this massive event happened and you're telling me that nobody talked about it? You know, the 80s wasn't that long ago. This is a pretty major event to have had happen to America and all this crazy stuff in these action sequences, and no one talks about it in current time. But regardless, yeah, it's not something you're really meant to just dwell upon. It's meant to just be its own singular experience that entertains you. And I absolutely adored the first Wonder Woman film. I thought it was great. I thought the performances were wonderful. The direction was engaging, and the way Patty Jenkins was able to infuse her own directing style, especially in the action, but mix in a little bit of flavor that was very reminiscent of what Zack Snyder was doing in the DCEU, was absolutely fantastic. And I think they crafted a really enjoyable film that just had a lackluster third act because it, you know, devolved into the, you know, CGI boss battles that we know and love that kind of ended up contradicting the overall theme and story of what was going on about making peace rather than war. But regardless, I really enjoyed the first film. And coming into the second film, I honestly didn't know what to expect. And that was in a good and bad way. I've caught a lot of flack leading up to the review of this film, because when all the marketing material was being released, I was just confused about what this movie was or what it was about. No one ever specifically stated what the villain's intentions were or what the film was about or who Wonder Woman was fighting. All we knew is that Steve Trevor was back and that Pedro Pascal was the villain. And to be honest, I see why they kept a lot of this close to the chest, because it is a bit of a surprise what they end up doing with this film. It's not necessarily your traditional superhero film to a certain regard. It almost kind of feels, the best way to describe this film is like a Saturday morning cartoon, and that's for better and for worse, for when it comes to this film. Because even when you're talking about the villain and Pedro Pascal, he's not some mustache twirling villain who's out to destroy the world. He's I wouldn't say honest, but he's a guy who's trying to make a living for his family, and his life is going awry, and through a magical artifact gains certain abilities that might be able to put him on top. But in consequence, it ends up, you know, obviously being a superhero film, risking the entire planet instead. And so in that regard, that's how you end up getting into these events of how they end up being able to bring back Steve Trevor and Gal Gadot having to come to terms with that. And then we also have the side plot of Barbara Minerva, played by Kristen Wiig, being this character who comes into play as someone who's jealous of Wonder Woman. And you have all these elements going around, which culminates into the story that we have. And to be honest, I see why this movie was really hard to market, because the premise is very lackluster. It's a very simple story that's being presented to us, and it's hard to kind of market that as this big $200 million blockbuster, when it's a very, to be honest, it's a very nice, almost like romantic comedy drama rather than a superhero film. There's not very much superheroing going on. Overall, I did enjoy a lot of elements in this film, but they just didn't quite come together. And in the very beginning of the film, it immediately sets this tone of almost being like this homage to Richard Donner's Superman, and it's kind of this cheesiness and this hokiness and this reverence of the 80s and a begotten time where heroes were just this, you know, zany, over-the-top characters, you know, taking on very generic bad guys. And there's a lot of homage to that in the opening hours of the film, or the opening hour, especially in the Mall of America fight scene. And it just, from that moment on, from that very beginning of the film, it really just sets this strange tone and this strange momentum and this strange pacing that kind of conflicts with itself. On one hand, it wants to be a very zany Saturday morning cartoon kind of film that is somewhat of an homage to older superhero movies, but at the same time, it wants to have this grounded, emotional message about the world and things that we wish for and taking things for granted and yada yada yada, and it's just a very conflicting film in that regard, and I think what makes it feel so all over the place, it makes the film feel so unfocused, is the length of it. This film is 2.5 hours long, and I'm gonna be honest with you, cut this movie down to like maybe between an hour 15 and hour 30, there's a great film in here. There really is a great film in here. A really enjoyable romp to where the cheesiness doesn't come off as something that's off-putting. It comes off as something as endearing, and the momentum of the story just keeps on going, and you have a great action, adventure, romance, dramedy that has this little sprinklings of a nice social message. But instead what we have is a very bloated film that drags on for quite some time, where a lot of elements don't really get as much shine as they should. And I think the best example of that comes in the form of just the villains, more so. Pedro Pascal takes up a very surprisingly large majority of the screen time in this film. I'd say almost as much as like Wonder Woman in this regard, and has more on-screen presence than Cheetah in that regard. So it's pretty insane that a lot of time is spent on him, which was good because he was honestly the most enjoyable performance in the film. But certain characters just kind of end up getting shafted, like Chris Pine coming back. He's just mostly there for jokes and a couple of emotional beats, but he's not necessarily there as this fully fledged character that's there to evolve and go on his own journey. It truly feels like his character arc and his journey ended in the first film, and he's just being brought back and drudged along to teach Wonder Woman a quick lesson, and then we just move on to a certain degree. And I think Cheetah kind of suffers the most because, well, she's only Cheetah for about 2 minutes of the film, and it's shadowed in darkness that you can barely see her. And then on top of that, the beginning of a performance for Kristen Wiig is spent kind of doing like that Ghostbusters thing where you make a couple of rapid jokes and you kind of talk kind of quietly and like, oh, okay, that style of comedy where they're obviously ad-libbing and improvising instead of saying what's on the page, because people think just saying random things is funny for the sake of saying random things. They were doing a lot of that in the beginning instead of giving her actual character development and personal things to go through. It was just a mess. It was just a mess. And then the way that they try to develop her through this guy that was harassing her, it's a whole mess with her storyline. And it's really unfortunate because I think Kristen Wiig was really, really strong in the role. I think as her character progresses and she becomes more like Cheetah, her role gets much better. It's much more down to earth. It's much more grounded. And she does a very serious gravitas given kind of role much better than when she's kind of doing her old Ghostbusters, SNL's kind of stick. shtick going on in the beginning of it. So you just have way too many elements that are going on that are pretty good between the villain, between what Gal Gadot's character of Wonder Woman is going through and her story arc, between what's going on with Cheetah, between the social message that they're trying to sell you throughout the whole entire duration of the film. There's a lot of different elements that just don't click together because a lot of those elements are so separate or so far apart because of the length of the film, but they don't feel like they're building towards something. It feels like we're waiting. We get a blip of development or a blip of something happening that's interesting or a blip of action, and then we're waiting for something else to happen. We tell a couple of jokes, we do a scene that doesn't really matter in the long grand scheme of the story, and it just keeps going. And I think, honestly, a big part of like just an example of just stuff that didn't need to be in the film was like probably the first 15 minutes where you have this opening sequence where they're basically doing like a flashback, and it's like the Olympics on Themyscira, and Wonder Woman as a child learns a lesson about being true to yourself and not taking the easy way and not taking a shortcut or the easy path out. And that's it. And it doesn't really relate to the rest of the film, except kind of in the social message. And I think she says one line from the lesson she learns in the beginning of the story, like near the end or something like that. And that was about it. But honestly, the story remains the same if you just completely cut out that opening section. And it's just, I feel like if you just cut out a lot of these elements and a lot of the bloat that is in this story and you condense it, it's a much more enjoyable focused ride, and these emotional beats and the social messages would hit a lot more. It honestly, I'd probably even take out Cheetah, even though I really liked Kristen Wiig's performance, just for the simple fact of there's so much going on with Pedro Pascal's villain, and he is so interesting, and his role in and of itself takes up so much screen time that it feels like it takes away from the shine that Kristen Wiig properly deserves for what I thought was a really, really enjoyable performance. And then to add on, to sprinkle onto this cake, it does kind of feel like Chris Pine is wasted as well, just because his storyline doesn't really get to go much of anywhere. It's used, like I said, for jokes, and then eventually teach Wonder Woman a lesson about, you know, moving on, very simplistic things. And then from there, the action sequences in this film are very few and far between, and normally that's not necessarily a bad thing in most films, or action films or superhero films, depending on what you're doing. As long as the action is character motivated or story motivated, it's perfectly fine, and it will make the story feel like the frequency of the action sequences are warranted. However, in this film, the action sequences are very brief and very lackluster with very shoddy CGI. Yeah, these action sequences where the Mall of America sequence is very hokey. There's the scene with the trucks that are in the trailer, and that one is okay, I guess, but it's still very inconsistent with the Wonder Woman's powers in it. Even though it's a story-related reason why, it still didn't make sense how at one moment she's, you know, struggling to push up against two trucks, but then at another moment she can literally kick the ground and like shatter the entire earth and then flip off of a truck. So I'm like, I see what you were trying to do earlier story-wise, but it doesn't make sense in this inconsistency in this very same action sequence. And on top of the lasso of truth gets way more screen time in this film, even gets a new superpower, but oh man, the CGI, something about it just looks like this golden spaghetti noodle that just so defies the laws of physics. The CGI just looks so bad on it for some reason. I don't know why, but it just looks like a cheap VFX every time that thing is on screen. Yeah, it's rough. It's really, really rough. But with that being said, the action sequences were not great, and they are very few and far in between, and they are very, very short. Despite all my gripes and grievances, to be honest, I still do really like the third act of this film. I think the social message for me personally hit home. I think the look, the costume was awesome. The golden costume was sick. The action sequence that was there for 2 minutes between Wonder Woman and Cheetah was it was fine. I would have like to have gotten more of it. But generally, the third act was much stronger because it was much more closely related to the theme of the story, which is, you know, and the first film was in complete opposition almost to a certain degree. I think the third act is much stronger in this film, and it feels exactly like just right, and they stick the landing, but they're sticking the landing on something that I feel like the first two acts are just way too long, they're too bloated, and they're just a mess in execution overall, which is really disappointing because I really, really like the first film, but this one just falls short in a lot of different categories for me. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic on the film, because that's the problem, is that there's so many elements of this film that I like, from the performances to the director, to, you know, the setting in general, even though it comes off as kind of hokey as compared to like trying to give this authentic, you know, vibe of the 80s. It's more so like this is the millennialized perspective of what the 80s were like as compared to what things were really like in the 80s, and especially you know, in certain areas and demographics and yada yada yada. But yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame. I know that a lot of people are really gonna like this film, and for them it'll be 2.5 hours of being able to sit there and enjoy the film and relax and get invested in this world, and a film that really, really takes its time. And some people, all this stuff will really hit home for them, and that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable, and that's why all films are subjective. But it's just, for me personally, I just think that the film is just lackluster, and it's unfortunately boring, just for the simple fact of this film needed to cut a lot of this stuff out and condense the film to make it a stronger package. It's not a bad film by any stretch of the imagination, it's just a forgettable one, and in some ways that's kind of worse, just for the simple fact of it's hard to be invested in something that's just not fully there, not fully, you know, formed in its whole entirety and its whole idea and what it needs to be. Yeah, I think that's the best way of putting it. It's a mess. The movie's an absolute mess. And it's kind of hard to talk about a lot of these elements without getting into full spoilers. So that's kind of been jumbling my thoughts together in that regard. I'm trying to give an overall picture, paint an overall consensus of how I feel about this film without getting into very specific elements and how certain things functioned. But generally, yeah, those are my thoughts of the film. Personally, should you watch it? If you're a really, really, really big Wonder Woman fan, sure, go ahead and watch it. No one's gonna stop you. If you're a big DCU fan, to be honest, I'd say skip it in that regard. I just don't really see myself recommending this movie to people. The first film I would highly recommend watching. The first film is very enjoyable. It's great. And to me, the first film handles a lot of those homages well without being cheesy. But yeah, this film just feels like a step backwards. This film feels like what would have been made first, and then the first film would have been made second. Yeah, it just needed more time, or it needed more eyes from other people to look at this film and be like, "Now, Patty, do we need this scene though? Do we need this scene though?" And it would have made a stronger overall package. But with that being said, guys, that's kind of where it is for me. If I were to give it a rating, I'd probably give it a 6 or a 5.5 out of 10. I don't know. Numbers are numbers. It's just hard for me to recommend this film. If you have nothing to watch, sure, watch it. But other than that, I can't really recommend this. I just did not have an enjoyable time. It dragged on, and I was just like, this movie is still not over yet. It just kept going. And I have no problem with long movies. I love films like Place Beyond the Pines, or I've seen Nymphomaniac Volume 1 and 2 back to back. Disturbing films. So I don't really have an issue with the length of the film, but it's about the pacing, it's about the way the story is constructed, it's about where the action is, where the story is going, and the way the development's being had. All those elements come into effect when making the overall package of if a film is enjoyable or not, you know? That's how a movie like Avengers can be 3 hours long. Avengers Endgame can be 3 hours long, but it doesn't feel like it because the story is moving along at an appropriate pace and you're engaged and locked in. Or something that's really short. It's like, I don't know, like an hour and some change, like a John Wick movie can be really short, but feels long and engaging because you're going from place to place to place. It's all about pacing. All about pacing and learning how to cut your lovies, as they call it. You cannot be afraid to cut out the things that, even though you love them so much, you got to get rid of them in the story because they're holding things down or they're holding things back. But with that being said, guys, let me know what you think of Wonder Woman 1984. Were you as disappointed with the film as I was? Or, are you much more keen on it? Was this a very enjoyable film for you? Let me know in the comment sections down below. You're like, hey, Daniel, you missed the mark at this one. Probably, but what can you do? Sue me. Please don't. With that being said, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go down there and hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe to become a part of the GeekSpeakNation channel. And also, while you're down there and you've subscribed, make sure you hit that bell icon and set it to all so you always get notified of when I post a new video. And with that being said, guys, don't forget to follow me over at twitch.tv/GeekSpeakGaming, where you can find me streaming live, playing some video games, which I hear they're pretty fun sometimes. But with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really, really do appreciate it. It feels so nice to review a movie and to watch a movie. Oh, it's such a beautiful feeling. I love cinema. With that being said, guys, I'm Daniel. Don't forget to get geeky.